Okay, welcome everybody, and happy Year of the Dragon. So happy to see you all here today for our Critical Issues Confronting China program. Given U.S. tensions and increasing concern in the U.S. about the kind of power China wields in the world, it's never been more important to understand just how China is doing these days. Is the system working? Just for starters, the government says that their GDP growth is 5.2%, but most economists say that it's way below that, if not flat. So what kind of threat is China? Can China develop a modern financial system and fit into the global financial system? Or will a state-dominated financial system interfere with global practices in unexpected ways? These are some of the huge questions that we're all facing these days. And so with us, to help us understand a key part of this, how China's financial system works under Xi Jinping, is our own Professor Meg Rithmire, who has been working for many years on questions relating to how the state and the Communist Party interact with the country's business sector and how a rising China fits into the global world order. Meg Rithmire, who we're all thrilled to say was recently awarded tenure, is the F. Warren McFarlan Associate Professor in the Business, Government, and International Economy Unit at the Harvard Business School. She holds a PhD in government from Harvard University, and her primary expertise is in the comparative political economy of development with a focus on China and Asia. Her first book, Land Bargains and Chinese Capitalism, examines the role of land politics, urban governments, and local property rights regimes in Chinese economic reforms. And her new book, which is a wonderful, fascinating read, Precarious Ties, Business and the State in Authoritarian Asia, investigates the relationship between capital and the state and globalization in China, Malaysia, and Indonesia. Joining Professor Rithmire in conversation following her talk is Daniel Koss, who has done extensive research into the party's role in the business sector. Daniel is Associate Senior Lecturer on East Asian Languages and Civilizations, and his first book, which was published in 2018, investigates the role of political parties under authoritarianism through the case of the Chinese Communist Party, and his second book, manuscript, studies East Asia's other super-resilient ruling party, named the Liberal Democratic Party of Japan. Before we begin, I just wanted to quickly note that there will be no critical issues speaker next week, but the following week on February 28th, we will have Min-Xin Pei from Claremont talking about China's surveillance state. That's going to be a really fascinating talk, so I hope you all come and join us on February 28th. So I'd like to turn it over to Professor Rithmire. Thank you.
So Dinda generously described my second book, about which I will say some things today, but the talk is more a general talk about the question that you see on the screen. Can China's financial system be effective? So first, I thought I would outline where we've been and where we're going over the last 10 years before we go back and then forward. So where are we in the Chinese financial sector is that we've seen post-global financial crisis around 2009 to 2012 or so. China, of course, dealt with the global financial crisis and the fall in export demand and the threat to economic growth in China by a massive stimulus. And I may describe parts of that stimulus, but it wasn't just through the financial, the finance mechanism, but also really through an exhortation to banks to lend to companies to invest. And so it was debt-driven as well as investment-driven at that point, but a huge stimulus which generated this overinvestment in infrastructure in China and debt, again, taken on by both corporations and by the Chinese financial sector and local governments in China to deal with that. That first kind of taste of a financial crisis in China in the modern era led to this 2013-2014 shift to equity markets, which produced a lot of outward flows of capital in China. I'm going to say more about all of those things. And then in 2015, 2016, that push of money and household savings into equity markets generated an equity market crisis, and then a debt crisis also for mostly corporate actors within China. And then it's really from 2016, I say all of this just to say the proper timeline to think about China's financial crackdown and financial financial crisis is not 2020 when Ant Financial's IPO was suspended. It's not this week as we see markets crash in China. It's really 2016, the moment after that stock market crisis in China, where financial regulators within the CCP became aware of the extent of financial risks and systemic risks within that system, and started to both crack down on official and unofficial actors within the system and reorganize China's financial structure. And so where are we, just to set the big stage? So I really consider this moment where we're all concerned about the end of the real estate economy in China and the real estate crisis, as well as the equity market crisis that's literally ongoing right now, as symptoms of an underlying set of problems. And I'm going to talk more about those problems than about the symptoms. And so you'll see a lot of people who say the solution to China's financial problems is investment in the stock market or stimulus in the economy. That's not what I'm here to discuss. It's the more structural and policy-driven trends over time. What are those, briefly, those underlying problems that I think political scientists and political economists are a little more uniquely addressed to understand rather than economists who look at this? Number one, China has a massive household savings rate. It is 50% of GDP, which is about 50% higher than, or about 100% higher really than what Americans save. And it's the highest savings to GDP ratio for any country for which we have data historically ever. And absorbing that household savings rate is a huge challenge to China's financial system, and one they've sought to deal with pretty unsuccessfully over the last 30 years or so. The second thing that they're trying to achieve with reforming their financial system is moving from an export and investment-driven economy, I'll say more about all of this, to an innovation and a consumption-driven economy. Thirdly, to deal with demographic change, right? The other big headline coming out of China, as if everyone's surprised that the birth rate has dropped and the population is aging rapidly. This was fully predictable based on data that we had scores of years ago. But that particular problem, in many ways, and historically and comparatively, has required a financial solution through which households can generate security for the future through the financial sector, and the financial sector can allocate capital to generate innovation-driven growth that's shared widely rather than just labor or export-driven growth. And lastly, more politically, what the CCP wants is to have a financial system that does all of these things, but nonetheless also emphasizes their priorities of regime discretion over economic policy and discipline. And I mean that politically rather than economically, right? So making sure that the right actors get capital and behave in the right ways, not just allocating resources according to market discipline. So those are the real challenges. What we're seeing now is this re-centralization of power over the Chinese financial sector and concentrated within the party itself. So here you see a little image of Xi Jinping sitting quite far from other people, actually, but at the center of this new commission, the Central Financial Commission, which has been established to deal with the financial sector. And I'm going to say a lot more about that in a moment. So what I want to do here is answer two questions and give two moments of comparison. The first question is going to take me a long time to answer, so I ask for your patience with that one. The last one will take me a brief second to answer, and it's the question that the talk starts with, which is, can China's financial system be effective? The first question is, what is the impetus? And if for those of you who get bored or have to leave, I will give you the answers to some of these questions a little bit in front. Why has the Chinese Communist Party completely overhauled its financial regulatory architecture? The second is two past episodes that give us some sense, or at least some knowledge about where they might be going and what the limitations of these reforms are. And third, this unprecedented challenge. So the executive summary. What is the impetus for reforming the financial sector? Well, first of all, I want to emphasize that they are right, that they needed to reform it, right? That the combination of financial malfeasance, which is significant in China, corruption and debt risks, has led them to believe that neither business nor technocrats or bureaucrats can really discipline financial markets or be disciplined by financial markets. And they're honestly not wrong, though I still think it's their fault. And so that story is going to take a while to tell, so I hope you bear with me while I tell that one. The two past episodes that are informative for what might happen over the next 5 to 10 years are first in the immediate past, the 2015 and 2016 stock market crisis, about which I'll say quite a bit. And second, this late 1990s to 2005 reform of the financial system under what was called then the Central Financial Work Commission, right? Very similar to the Central Financial Commission. And that was a reform that was initiated by Premier Zhu Rongji and then discontinued by Wen Jiabao and reformed into a system that is the kind of the system we've had for the last 10 years. And so I'll say more about that. I'm going to argue that the stock market crisis gives us a lot more equipment to understand in what direction the CCP is going now, whereas this late 1990s, early 2000s reform is not likely to be repeated in terms of having the party first seize control and then redelegate to the state apparatus, right? I don't think that that's likely to happen in this particular round. And lastly, I will argue that China faces an unprecedented challenge. And I mean unprecedented not just for China, but actually in the world, which is, can China have a modern financial system with a closed political system? So a lot of ink has been spilled on how China grew at all, given its, let's say, inauspicious formal political institutions. And I want to argue that in some ways, getting from a poor agrarian country to a globally integrated and industrialized country is a little bit easier than going from industrialized to high technical, innovative, consumption-driven growth. For that second transition, you really need a financial sector, and that is, I think, much harder to do with China's political institutions than that first stage of growth. And so can China have a modern, effective financial system? My answer is basically no. But you don't believe me yet, and that's reasonable. Okay. So what is the old financial system? So if we have an overhaul of this regulatory architecture, what are we overhauling? So what we're overhauling, or what the CCP is overhauling, is what dominated the financial sector from the end of those Wen Jiabao reforms in 2003, 2005 to the present, which is what's called Yi Hang San Hui, a one bank, three systems system. So there was the People's Bank of China, which is the monetary authorities, and then three separate commissions for securities, for banking, and for insurance to regulate those three separate sectors of the financial system. In the wake of that Wen Jiabao reform, about which I'll say more in a minute, the focus has been on bureaucratization, right? Making sure basically that modern kind of the edifice of financial governance and things like the China Securities Regulatory Commission or the China Insurance Regulatory Commission, that those are staffed with not party type people, right, but kind of formal bureaucrats with traditional training in either legal regulation or financial regulation, and turning that over to the state rather than the party to govern. At the same time, it's been kind of informally driven by the financialization of SOE management. So what really happened in that late 1990s, again, I'm going to say more about this, is the transition from state-owned enterprises in China from being governed by or even owned by ministries, right, and run in that certain way. And we had this let go of the large, let go of the small, grab the large movement in the late 1990s, which privatized or semi-privatized a lot of local state-owned enterprises. And the remainder, these big state-owned firms, which many of us know, household names, Sinopec, Costco, et cetera, are ones that are controlled by the SASAC, a central commission, and they are financialized in the sense that they all IPO'd after these reforms in the early 2000s, and so they also are listed on the stock market, and this becomes important a little bit later. What is the new regulatory structure? Well, there are formal changes and there are informal changes. So the formal changes in the architecture is that the China Insurance and Banking Regulatory Commissions were merged into one commission from 2018 to 2023. At the same time that merger took place, there was established a Financial Stability and Development Committee in 2017, again, in the wake of that financial market crisis and in the wake of capital flight from China and concerns about debt risks throughout the Chinese political economy. And that working group, that committee, was set to design a new system that would control these financial risks. And I will just note here that in 2015, 2016, the National Security Law of China listed financial stability as a pillar of national security in China, right? So this idea that systemic risks really threatened the stability of the regime had much more to do, right, with the continued monopolization on political power from the CCP and the fear of a financial crisis generating political instability than it did with any kind of sense of governing just financial risk alone. What we had last year is the announcement of this Central Financial Commission, which is an overarching body that's supposed to govern all three of these sectors, insurance, banking, and securities, as well as other things. And then on the state side, what's called the National Financial Regulation Administration, and that's chaired by the Minister of Finance. So those are the formal changes. And the informal changes are threefold, I think. First, the extensive use of what I have called the state coercive apparatus, so thinking about the Central Commission on Disciplinary Inspection, the arrest of financial principals, both within firms and within the party state itself, and the treatment and that kind of coercive treatment of regulators and market participants as a part of how the CCP is dealing with financial risks. Second, the extensive expansion of party monitoring and control inside banks and enterprises. So Daniel has written extensively and quite carefully about that. My co-author Hao Chen and I have also written about that particular movement, right, to put the party state into firms and on the board of directors to see what firms are doing. And that's related to this last point, which is state shareholding. So the movement and the language in China has come from managing enterprises. So instead of managing the state-owned enterprises themselves, to managing capital and having those state-owned enterprises become capital investment vehicles, alongside the rise of government guidance funds, the Chanye Jijin, that are part of China's technological upgrading, as well as, and I'll show some of the data that Hao and I have on this, minority shareholding on the part of the state in non-state enterprises really throughout the Chinese economy. So what's the impetus for that dramatic change, right, in both formally and informally how things are managed? This is the long part of the story. So let me go back really to the 1990s. And Daniel's very nice to have a copy of my book here, and Dinda introduced the book. And a lot of this is indeed coming from this particular, oh, thank you, Daniel. I'm going to date myself, but my Vanna White, I guess. But in any case, so, and that book really is an exploration of how authoritarian regimes deal with projects of financial liberalization and how state business relationships are changed during that process. And so a lot of this is coming from that particular that research project in that book, which compares China, Indonesia, and Malaysia. And I'll say something about Malaysia at the very, very end. So what is China's financial past, right? What was going wrong such that there were so many of these problems that emerge in the modern era, and why did those problems emerge? So we have to go back a little bit. And I said a lot of ink has been spilled on the question of how did China even grow given these terrible formal institutions? And so sometimes I start these talks by showing that China ranks between Panama and Kyrgyzstan in the ease of doing business from the World Bank, right? And those countries have growth rates of 2%, whereas China's growth rate is always much higher than that. What gives, right? It's also very low. My favorite one is it's always in the 170s on getting a construction permit. Yet we go to China and see with our eyes so much construction. So what's going on here, right? And so in general, the answer to that has been that informal arrangements between capitalists and lower levels of the state, and then eventually higher levels of the state, facilitated commerce amidst these kind of inauspicious formal institutions, right? And that's a fine answer. I don't quibble with that at all. But the interesting part of that is corruption exists everywhere, right? And these low-level informal arrangements can exist in any country. But not every country gets integrated into global markets and grows so dramatically over that period of time. And so why did we have not only economic growth in China, but economic growth that was really so productive for such a long period of time? And so in the book, I answer that question by talking about China's financial and fiscal discipline. And within that, I make a controversial argument. So famously, and most of you know this, China's private sector capitalists were excluded from the financial sector in China for a long period of time, really until the early 2000s. And most people think of that as inefficient. That means that this vast pool of household savings, right, ended up going through the banking system and into SOEs, which were inefficient. And had the private sector had access to that capital, then China could have grown much faster. But that would assume a financial sector with real transparency, accountability, and true liberalization, right, which China and most authoritarian regimes are not willing to tolerate. And so in this interesting way, the private sector being excluded, right, from the financial sector meant that they had to be extraordinarily disciplined in what they did. So where did they get capital? They mostly got capital, right, from retained earnings, which is very interesting from the perspective of modern China, because to get capital from retained earnings means you have to earn something and retain those earnings. And actually, it looks like from corporate finance data, the vast majority of large Chinese firms right now don't actually earn anything, and so have very little to retain, right? And so most of their startup capital and their investment capital ongoing came from either retained earnings, right, which they rapidly reinvested, or it came from sort of less than arm's length lenders, right, being both, this kind of curb banking or back alley banking, as my co-author and other project, Kelly Tsai, has described it. So those disciplined networks of people who know each other and hold one another accountable for social and professional reasons. Or they got foreign direct investment, FDI, which is notoriously disciplined and only went to firms that could rapidly integrate themselves into global markets and again then make earnings, retain those earnings, and reinvest them. So that financial discipline, ironically, made it so that, in fact, the private sector was very productive, right? So you can imagine a world in which this informal collusion occurs, but it doesn't necessarily lead to dynamic economic growth. But here you have to ask yourself where the discipline came from, and it came from that financial exclusion. And the fiscal discipline came from the decentralization of finance in China. This is a story that has been told many times by many people, including myself and other people in this room, which is basically the decentralization of finance and the financial independence of private firms, right? So what do I mean by that? And famously, kind of in the early 1980s, China decentralized the financial sector such that local governments would get to control the tax revenue generated within their jurisdiction. And so in that way, everyone kind of had these incentives. I get to keep the tax revenue either for my own purposes or for investment in things I care about or my own political kind of career. Plus, you are disciplined and have to make investments that are very productive. This falls apart a little bit later, and it'll put all this particular period in high relief. And so that particular financial or fiscal system, in addition to the financial sector, made it such that most growth was productive and dynamic at that time in collusion between the private sector and local governments. My argument is that discipline broke down in both the financial and the fiscal systems over the course of the 1990s and 2000s. So for the social scientists in the room, I will take a moment and say, I apologize, there is no exogenous shock. So it's not a system, it's not a situation where I can show this one policy changed and then everything changed, but it was an accumulation of changes in addition to an exogenous shock. And so let me say something about that exogenous shock, which you see here in the dotted line. And most of you, again, are quite familiar with this. And so you can see this process of fiscal decentralization, right, happening here, whereby the central share of total tax revenues goes down, down, down as local governments retain more of that share. And in 1994, it was re-centralized, right, for a variety of reasons that I won't go into. But you can see the black line, which is the central share of total expenditures, continues to go down. So this gap means that local governments are responsible for the lion's share of expenditures in China on pensions, on healthcare, on infrastructure, education, all of those things, yet their access to resources becomes constrained in this period. What do they have instead? Land, right? And so I'm just going to show one picture from the city of Harbin where I did a lot of field work in the 2000s and early 2010s. And this was a real revelatory moment because I was riding around with this local official and I said, oh, what kind of investment are you getting here? How is that going to be productive? And he said, I don't care if it's productive or not. Investment high, GDP growth high, I leave in a few years, I don't really care anymore, right? So you get this interesting system through which local bureaucrats are evaluated, and I don't want to make too much of this, because he was also lining his pockets with the kickbacks from some of those investments. And so it's not just about promotion, it's about how much money he can make while he's there, which again is quite crass, but nonetheless true in many circumstances. But you get this situation where local governments are evaluated based on, or local officials, based on how much GDP growth they generate. A lot of that can just come from investment alone, and no one cares down the line whether it's productive or not. And so you have the breakdown in the fiscal system, right? So they can get money from basically land leasing sales, a re-centralization of tax revenue, and such that local governments no longer depend on productive economic activity. They depend on basically investment economic activity with a time horizon that can be not necessarily consonant with their political careers or their personal ambitions. And in the financial system, especially in the late 1990s and the early 2000s, you get the creation of this bureaucratic financial system, and I call it an edifice in the sense that it looked kind of like a normal financial sector regulation, right? You have these different kind of departments, you have these different functional areas, right? But you don't have the discipline. And why is because bureaucrats were meant to replace the party as a source of discipline, but they failed for a variety of reasons that I'd like to go into. So what's very interesting is that over the course of the 2000s, as the financial sector is partially liberalized, you see a massive growth in credit in China and credit to the private sector. So many people have kind of held on to this idea that all credit is going to local governments in China or all credit is going to SOEs, and it's not true. Actually, a lot of credit in China went to the private sector over the course of the 2000s. And where did it go? Instead of this kind of symbiotic growth, right, with corruption, and so it's not a perfect allocation of resources, we get this investment-driven growth with substantial resource misallocation. There's a massive expansion in public and private debt. We do get the development of firms with incredibly complex corporate governance structures, and I'll show some of that. Again, Hao Chen and I have a paper on that as well. Let me first say, what does all this mean? The argument I make in the book is that China over this period shifted from mutual alignment to mutual endangerment. Mutual endangerment being a mode of state-business relations whereby a fundamentally vulnerable capitalist class had privileged access in some ways to the financial sector, yet the financial sector wasn't fully liberalized in that it didn't have accountability and transparency, and interest rates weren't liberalized. They couldn't actually price risk based on the actual risk, right? Which means that there's this frenzy to use political connections to get access to bank capital in China in ways that is quite opaque, difficult to hold accountable, and certainly difficult for financial markets to adjudicate and hold accountable. And so I'm not going to go too much into this, but the signs of mutual endangerment in the book, which again, it's comparative, and so I show this in Indonesia as well as in China, are three things. You get asset expatriation, so vulnerable capitalists moving capital way out of China as fast as they can. Again, did not start in 2022 when Jack Ma moved to Singapore. Did not start this year, right, or in the wake of the COVID reforms. It started a long time ago in China, I would say the 90s actually, getting capital out of China. Weaponized information, whereby you have these opaque yet extremely consequential relationships between political and business elites, and looting. Looting is my favorite, not only because it's the most interesting, but you see this particular political economic behavior, and you see it in late Suharto, Indonesia, as well as in contemporary China, whereby you have private sector firms. Everyone expects public sector firms to be inefficient and to kind of cannibalize their own resources, supposedly, right? But you have private sector firms that are indebting themselves beyond repair, expatriating their assets, right? And in fact, the principals are looting their own business resources, which all of the people I work with across the river would say is irrational behavior, right, on the part of a capitalist, right? Why would you run your firm into the ground? And the answer is because you don't have high expectations for the future, right? You don't know when the crackdown's coming. You don't know when the next wave of policy is coming. You're fundamentally vulnerable, and it makes sense to make money now rather than invest money to make it later. All of this, remember, is possible only because that financial sector became, in a limited way, open to the private sector, right? If it's fully closed and they can't get capital this way, then these behaviors are not really possible. Let me show you some examples of these behaviors. So this is one of my favorite things to show, which is China's external balances over the course of the 2000s, since really 2000. And what you see basically is that, and this is not really in high relief, I apologize. Usually I have it with color. I don't know what happened here. But what we see is this dark gray line right here is China's outward direct investment, right, over the course of the 2000s. And the line that is the lighter gray line is China's errors and omissions. So I know any of my MBA students here, you know how to read a balance of payments sheet. But for those of you who are not as familiar, what it means is that for every renminbi, every yuan that was going from China into foreign direct investment, and this is the period of Belt and Road, this is the period of Zhou going out, this is the period of made in China, high-tech acquisitions all over the globe. For every renminbi that was going out of China formally to invest in other parts of the world, $1 was going missing, was leaving in a suitcase or actually through a casino in Macau or through transfer pricing, all of these kinds of things, which shows a fundamental insecurity on the part of the Chinese capitalist class. And where was most of the FDI going, by the way? Many people think China's FDI all goes to politically weak institutions, countries, right, with natural resources in Southeast Asia or Africa or Latin America. But actually, the bulk of it was going to the United States and Europe during this period, immediately before the financial crackdown started. Some of that was going into high-tech acquisition, but a lot of it, especially on the part of private firms, was going into the purchase of football clubs in Europe, was going into real estate, leisure investment all over the world, right? And as one person said to me during this time period, yes, I pay premium prices for real estate in Europe because that's the price I pay to turn my renminbi into euros that can't be taken from me, right? So this huge movement to asset expatriation, sometimes on the part of the very firms, such as Evergrande, that were the most indebted in China at that time, right? The second is weaponized information. I'm just going to show you one slide about that, which is kind of a tale of four tycoons. I'm not going to say much about any of them. Some of them are familiar to you, some of them are not. The puzzle, I think, that's interesting, so you have Xiao Jianhua here. Many of you know who that is, right, who was the kind of banker to the elites, who was kidnapped from Hong Kong in 2017, finally sentenced in the summer of 2022. And then Guo Guanchang below him, right, who was subject to more of a detain and catch and release policy, right, where he was detained several times over 2015, 2016, 2017, still leads his firm, Fosun, right, although Fosun was forced to unwind internationally. And it's very difficult to prove in social science terms, but my argument in the book is that basically what you have is informal relationships that are very much obscured. So in social science, we love to study like who's on the board of directors and how do those connections get measured in market capitalization when there are political events. That's nice if it's transparent. But when it happens to be the cousin of your driver's wife who holds the directorship or holds a share in the company way back in the beneficial ownership, it's a lot more difficult to show how those relationships are affected. And so my argument in the book is that a lot of these dynamics are explained by, why was Xiao Jianhua detained for 5 years before he was sentenced? Why was Guo Guanchang caught and released, right? Whereas HNA, we saw that company go completely bust and become essentially, bankrupt. Anbang was nationalized at the same time. And the argument that I make is that some of these people hold very damaging information about political elites, and that some of that information ends up being more valuable over time than others, and they find themselves immune to these kinds of outcomes. All right, and lastly, looting, which I said is my favorite. So two key examples. And my colleague Bill Kirby's here, who's worked on HNA quite a lot, and so I'm going to malign HNA just a little bit, but rest in peace, it doesn't exist anymore, so there's no one to come after me. But Luckin Coffee on the left. Everyone's had a Luckin Coffee who's been to China in the last 10 years, right? So Luckin Coffee did this really interesting thing, which is that it IPO'd in the US, right, in 2018, I think it was. It was one of the fastest foundings to IPOs in history, and how Chen and I have looked very deeply into the ways in which they did it. And Luckin was actually founded by an entrepreneur who serially invested in new sectors, IPO'd really quickly, and then basically bankrupted his own firm. And so the same thing basically happened in Luckin, right, where US investors, because they're listed in New York, end up uncovering a massive fraud with their reported revenue data and customer data. They've reformulated themselves and said, yeah, we stole money from foreign investors, but that makes us part of the nationalist cause, which is very interesting. I will say the coffee was fine. But in any case, right, so this whole story of why would that happen, right? Why would that happen in contemporary China, especially when it turns out, by proof, Luckin can build an extraordinarily, profitable business in the long term if they choose to invest that way. And so this pattern of IPO fraud, this pattern of looting one's own business, right, happens quite extensively, and the book gives a lot of colorful examples of that, and it was fun to work on. HNA is a similar example, right, where they overexpand rapidly into Europe and the United States, right? It turns out a lot of their corporate subsidiaries, they have, in Dave Barbosa's estimation, I used a lot of his data from my work, maybe 2,000 or 3,000 subsidiaries, which is too many, actually, for a company like that. And why do they have so many subsidiaries? And most of them are hidden, right? You have to uncover them through deep corporate governance filings, is because they're designed that way to opaquely hide the way in which they use assets within that particular company. Evergrande, I would argue, is also an example of looting, right? And the argument, the economics argument from looting comes from a pretty famous economics paper about the savings and loan crisis in the United States and about a similar banking crisis in Chile in the 1980s, right? And the idea is, why would you have bankruptcy for profit, right? And because basically the benefits to bailout and the expected bailout is better than the benefits to long-term investment, right? And I would argue that Evergrande, right, was also basically pursuing bankruptcy for profit until it proved to not profit them anymore, right? And so you have this huge opaque corporate organization, 2,939 subsidiaries, and they're not organized in a way such that every local Evergrande is its own subsidiary, so that's not what I'm counting. It's a bunch of financial firms as well, a bunch of securities firms. Xu Jiayan's personal fortune was expatriated a long time ago in 2014, 2016. They had a rational expansion, diversification, again, buying football clubs in Europe. God bless the Chan School of Public Health, but donating $100 million to the Chan School of Public Health at the height of the pandemic when they did not have $100 million to donate was a very interesting thing. Assumption of excessive risk, and even within the company, press their own employees into lending the company money at difficult times, right? So this is an example of looting type behavior. I won't keep going, but China Minsheng Investment Group is another one that we've written about, which went basically from the imprimatur of the Goldman Sachs of China or the JP Morgan of China to state receivership within, I think it was 4 years, basically. And so because all of the company's principals, which were private investors, had pledged their shares, done enough self-dealing such that the company was insolvent and no one had responsibility for it anymore, even though it had a very high level of political visibility. And in fact, none of these principals have been disciplined by the party state so far. All right, and so I'm gonna skip this for the sake of time, although just to say, this financial liberalization did not just include an expansion of lending and an expansion of equity markets, but also what Lucy Hornby has described as financial democratization of China, right? So the push for all of these instruments to get household savings, some kind of return, including peer-to-peer lending platforms, which took about 2 years, right, to develop such an extensive amount of fraud within that particular financial vertical that you had these founders absconding to Japan, of all places, and doing all these things, and a huge amount of protest in 2018 and 2019 in Shanghai and in Beijing over this particular form of a kind of savings vehicle in China. All right, and this is a map just to show, this is from the book, and this is from deep corporate filings and bond prospectus work, which is a map. You see H&A on the left and Wanda on the right, right? And these are the size of the dot represents the size of the loan, and these are the banks they took loans from. So I'm not a professor of corporate finance, but I worked with several to do this work. And I can tell you this is not a normal pattern, right, for firms to have this much dispersion in their financial borrowings. And again, this is traced from their subsidiary companies, some of which are not listed as formal subsidiaries of those companies, but they are subsidiaries of those companies, right? So this massive expansion of opaque financial dealings, which created these huge indebted behemoths that the party state had very little line of sight to until 2015, 2016, when they start to get very panicked. And indeed, they talk about it as an iceberg risk, right? So they can only see the tip of the iceberg, but perhaps below the surface, these financial risks are even more systemic than what they thought. All right, I'm going to skip that stuff about official corruption because we know it. All right, so what is the impetus? So the CCP became convinced that markets and regulators alone cannot discipline financial actors. And the argument that I make in the book is that they might be right, right? And why are they right? Because fundamentally, these market participants have short time horizons for political reasons. They expect either closeness to the state, they have closeness to the state, and they expect that that closeness will either yield for them the benefit of bailout, like it did for China Minsheng Investment Group, or the punishment of expropriation and basically state coercion. In either case, your incentives are to get while the getting is good and expatriate your assets, right, rather than to invest in the very long term. China also has, over this time period, as I mentioned, the financialization of the SOEs, what we might call a dual regulatory system, which is that they want state-owned enterprises to be listed on stock exchange, but everyone knows in China that the idea of a minority shareholder protection, right, for the holder of a share of Costco or Sinopec is a fiction, right? You're not going to get insight into the corporate governance and financial risk practices of those companies. We know their bottom line is political, but we'll never know how they execute it, although I have great colleagues who are doing research on that, right? And so one of the most revelatory moments of fieldwork for me was when someone said, look, the state-owned companies just pretend to be having modern formal corporate governance structures. Why can't we, right? And fundamentally, it's quite interesting, because to have a financial sector that's going to be modern requires accountability, transparency, a rule of law. You can't have half of the stock market subjected to that and the other half immune from it because they are state financial vehicles, right? So this dual regulatory system made it such that private sector enterprises were able to behave in ways that they wouldn't necessarily be able to behave in other systems. And again, this lack of transparency and rule of law. 2 past episodes. And this is much shorter, Daniel, by the way. So I have just about 4 minutes of things to say about this and 4 minutes of things to say about the last question about China's challenge. So I want to talk about these 2 episodes. The first is this episode in the late 1990s. In the wake of the Asian financial crisis, right, which scared CCP leadership quite seriously, right? If this could happen in Indonesia, you get one financial sector and then the guy who's been there for 30 years and he's out. Not only that, but that came on the heels of the mid-1990s debt and inflation crises, which I wrote about in my first book. And SOE reform, again, the 主大放小, the retain the large and let go of the small, that particular SOE reform, right, which left the state actually with the concern of a lot of what's called NPLs, non-performing loans, right? So there were a bunch of both retained state-owned enterprises that had non-performing loans as well as privatized ones that were privatized basically at a loss to the state because they were so heavily indebted. And so the problem was, how do we deal with this financial sector, which is basically misallocated capital, and we want a next stage of growth, which is driven by consumption and innovation, sounds familiar, right? And they want a financial sector that will allow them to do that. So, and here I'm basing this on Sebastian Heilmann's excellent work on this. So what they pursued at the time under Zhu Rongji was a vertical reorganization through Leninist means. So calling on the party state to wrest control, what they called departmental control. So the problem was that the financial sector was relatively decentralized geographically, and so local, provincial, and municipal authorities had a lot of power over who local banks would lend to, and they said this is no longer tenable, right? We've got to have that power be reorganized, and it's going to go through the party, right? So they created this extra institutional body, which was indeed the Central Financial Work Commission, that would wrest this power and think about how that financial sector would be reorganized. And so these efforts came with party discipline and supervision under Zhu Rongji. So Zhu very much emphasized it's got to be the party rather than just regulators or financial sector personnel that allocate capital. And so he focused on putting party personnel and recruiting the right personnel at that time to do that, to basically enforce discipline within the financial sector. It was never meant to last forever, right? The view was always that they would reorganize it, explore how it might be reorganized, and then somehow institutionalize some of those reforms. And so in 2003, Wen Jiabao said, okay, we've done enough. We've created this modern financial regulatory structure, and so we now need to pursue what they call departyization, right? So removing the party element from providing the discipline here over who gets what kind of credit and who gets what kind of access to household savings through equity markets or, again, indirectly through banks. And Wen Jiabao dissolves the Central Financial Work Commission and pursues bureaucratic control in the form of the Yihang Sanhui, the one bank and three systems, thing that was the kind of extant institutional structure until essentially 2018, as I said before. And very interestingly, 3 people basically said around this time, so Huang Yasheng a little bit early, Margaret Pearson in 2005, and Sebastian Heilmann himself in 2005. They've done this, it's quite amazing, we're not sure it's going to work. Why? Because there's a huge gap between the career expectations of these financial regulators and bureaucratic control, right? So they're kind of, in Margaret Pearson's words, neither here nor there within the party-state hierarchy within China, so they don't have huge probabilities to advance, right? They are a kind of professionally trained cadre, but they don't get the kind of regulatory control that you see at something like the SEC in the United States, right? And so this gap and this inability of cadres within a Leninist system to evaluate what they're doing based on anything other than targets than the state gives them means that this is likely not going to work. And they were right, is what I would say. They were right. It didn't work, right? Those regulators were imbued with neither the power to really control many of the actors in the system, particularly those who were politically connected, nor were they given the career incentives, right, to take on those kinds of roles, nor were they given the remuneration, right, to shield them from what the party eventually calls predation and hunting of financial regulators, which happens in spades throughout the 2000s. So what's different about that episode in the present? is that in 2003, it was a retreat of the party in favor of bureaucracy. I do not predict we are going to see that in the short or medium term here. The problems in 2003 that they were addressing were departmental and local influence rather than private sector actors, right? And in general, this massive suite of economic actors. So it was all about how do we get local governments out of the credit dispensation system rather than how do we deal with corporate behavior that we find to be politically and financially systemically risky. The discipline in 2003 was for public sector firms and agents, which are disciplined through the CCDI hierarchy or the CCP organizational department, and now the CCDI, right? Whereas now the discipline is for financial market participants, which are usually disciplined by financial markets, which is very hard to tolerate for the CCP. And at that time, that non-performing loan, the debt problems were orders of magnitude smaller, and also China grew out of them, right? So the whole idea of this toxic balance sheet of banks, China had enough room to grow that it could grow out of that, right? So there's a real difference, although I think it's really important for students of China to understand, we've seen this bureaucratic reorganization kind of pattern before within the financial sector in China. And that came to a conclusion that didn't quite work, and now they're trying it again. My suspicion is it might not work this time either for basically obvious structural reasons. I think the 2015 crisis is more immediately informative for what we're likely to see in the next couple of years. And frankly, I wrote that slide for a different talk last week, and the last week has been quite interesting and has, I think, borne me out a little bit, although it's hard to tell if someone's right within a week. And don't come back to me in 2 weeks if I'm wrong. But in any case, so what happened in 2013, 2014, the slowing growth and the fear of overinvestment in real estate, sounds familiar, prompted this monetary easing, a push to get capital into the non-state sector. You had an encouragement of equity growth in 2015, right? So the People's Daily publishing all these editorials saying Chinese stock markets are the way to go. There's no such thing as bubbles. Bubbles are for tulips and bitcoins, not for our equity markets. If you're a financial participant in China, you hear, great, the state won't let the stock market fail. Sure thing, I'll put it in, right? So they put a huge expansion of retail investing at this time with extensive margin lending, right? So lending on credit in hierarchical forms. I won't go into all of that. But these financial innovations, in addition to the P2P platform, or the P2P things, there were the Helms platform, which is super interesting. It was actually an Alibaba invested company. The first time he was detained, actually, by authorities, where basically allowed one person at the top of the hierarchy to lend money to a bunch of people, but then pull their money all at once if the stock market went down. So what actually happened in 2015, 2016 was that the equities were following faster than the regulators thought was physically possible, in a kind of echo of the ticker tape from 1929. And they didn't know this platform existed or how it worked, right? Which shows you the extent to which these bureaucrats were not effectively even understanding the sectors that they were charged with regulating. So there ends up being a bubble. The bubble initially pops and they say, this is an important market correction, and then everyone here is, great, I'll pull all my money out because they're not going to do anything. So within 2 days, they say, oh, but this correction is too rapid. And so they respond in this kind of populist and nationalist and state-driven way, right? So they suspend IPOs, they arrest and interrogate financial market participants, including journalists. A national team of investors invests 1.3 trillion renminbi to lift share prices in something that seems very familiar given the current moment. Tsinghua School of Economic Management graduates were told to shout, revive the A shares and benefit the people at their graduation, which is part of this kind of populist response to what happened within the markets, right? What ends up happening, right, is this national team, does all of these things. There are counterparties, there's insider trading, so they then have to crack down on those people and figure out how they did it, and then bring them under the state coercive apparatus. And then again, this is just data from Hao Chen in my paper from 2020 that shows that actually 5 years on, this is a little complicated, but 5 years on, you still see a massive amount of state holding, right? And the very minority shares. So the means being like in the 1s and 2s, very minority shareholders, but in over half of listed firms, basically in Shanghai and Shenzhen, and the majority of that are non-state firms, right? So they're holding massive amounts of shares in the Chinese economy overall. Those positions haven't been unwound, and actually cut to today, they're being reinvested, I think, in spades. All right, so one quick thing before I turn to, and I think that's a much more likely scenario given what's happening in China now and Xi Jinping's commitment to the party first. So one comparison to Japan. before I can move on, inspired by Daniel's work, and Christina's in the room, so they can both tell me that I'm wrong, which would be great and very instructive for me. Which is that plenty of people have compared what's happening to China to two things. Is China having its Lehman Brothers moment? People have been asking that since 2021, and they're still asking it, which I think is interesting, because things happen quite quickly here, in my recollection, having lived through that moment in the United States. And the other is to Japan, right? Has the bubble popped? Is China never going to grow again? They're entering a long period of deflation and low to no economic growth, lost decades. It's the same thing as Japan. And I would say yes and no, right? Some of the structural impediments to growth are similar in terms of financial misallocation and debt, right? Real estate investment in particular in Japan. But actually the Japanese stock bubble and real estate bubble was actually orders of magnitude higher than China's, relatively speaking. And more importantly, Japan was at a much higher level of development at that time, right? So most Japanese households had entered the upper middle class, and Japan itself was a high income country at that point. Japan also had a favorable external environment, right? In the sense of, if Japan wasn't going to grow, could it still count on Western countries in a Western-dominated global order to get the resources that it needed? Absolutely, right? Japan's basically a military ally of the United States, which was leaving the global order at that time. And, was growth existential to Japan? Japan, maybe a one-party dominated democracy, but a democracy at least in formal terms, right? And so there wasn't a fear of the loss of monopoly on political control that the CCP might have, right? So there's good news and bad news. The good news is that there's more room to grow in China, but I would argue it's going to take a financial sector that actually works. And basically, China can't just waste away, right? And I always laugh at the idea of lost decades in Japan, because those of you who've been to Japan, it's quite a nice place. And so the economists think it's like the worst outcome of all time, but actually it's a nice place. They're doing fine. I'm sorry that they don't buy so many TVs and things from Walmart as Americans, but they have tiny houses and long-lasting, durable consumer goods, and maybe we should buy more Japanese rice cookers and fewer boatloads of carloads of groceries from Walmart that we throw away every week. But that's just my American criticism. So in any case, Japan is fine, right? But China can't endure 2 decades of slow to no growth, right? Because it has much more room to grow. It doesn't have the sense it can get what it needs from the external environment, and it's existential for the continued monopoly on political power in China. So what's China's unprecedented challenge? How do you get from here to there, right? And how they got from back there to here is, I think, a different answer than sometimes what we're given, right? So how did China grow without these requisite institutions for so long? Number one, the private sector was willing to take risks, and it had discipline for reasons I hope I've explained. Second, frankly, China had some serious economic endowments that most countries don't have. They had a highly literate, well-trained, well-disciplined population at the moment of the reforms in 1978. They also had a favorable external environment in 2 ways. One, it was a period of globalization. World markets were open to Chinese goods. Second, China was able to extract bargains from global investors that other countries cannot possibly compete with, because to say to foreign direct investors, or people who want access to China's market, yeah, but we want some tech transfer, we want local employment, we want upgrading, right? Not every country is able to do that, because it's just not able. It's either its government isn't organized enough. I'm convinced India would do it if its government were organized enough, but it's not. But in any case, or right, they just don't have enough market share that companies like, well, I shouldn't name them, but GE, right, and Siemens would be willing to transfer technology in exchange for accessing that market. And so China got very lucky for a long period of time. Not to say they did nothing right, but they got out of the way and did very lucky. But the next stage of growth is not through backing off, it's through innovation and consumption. And innovation and consumption-driven growth requires a financial sector, right? If the financial sector doesn't function, then households save their money and don't know where to put it because they don't trust the future, because they have insecurity for demographic reasons, right, and for structural reasons of economic change, right? And if you want them to be willing to consume, it requires a financial sector that they can trust to get a return on their savings for a long period of time. Modern financial sectors require trust, they require accountability, transparency, and impartial enforcement of rules. And I'm not sure China is able to do that. There's a huge part of my book that's about trust. And I'm not going to read these out loud, but I hope you can see some of them. And maybe I'll read the second just for the benefit, right? In the early days, My company, they say, they didn't know what would happen to their investments. They took every opportunity they could. If a friend was in a high position at a bank, they would borrow because who knows what could happen tomorrow. For me, I could also lose my job anytime. So I took every opportunity to get rich. Get rich today because tomorrow you don't know, right? That's the sense of fundamental vulnerability that I think is endemic in the Chinese political system, partly because of the campaign-style governance, but partly just because of the uncertain status of entrepreneurs and the fact that the party can, in fact, crack down on you at any time, as we're learning in spades in the current moment. And I don't see how that level of like the kind of moral economy of trust and financial participation in China without transparency really works in a modern financial sector. Last slide, my conclusion. What might we see, right? What would work, right? And again, this is partly from the book, but I think what we're observing in ways that are instructive is what I might think of as the Malaysianization of China. So, we were just talking before, why would you compare China with Malaysia and Indonesia? Well, because it helps in a lot of ways, right? And Malaysia, Indonesia, also authoritarian countries for a long period of time. They may both, one's a democracy now, they voted yesterday, one may be a democracy right now, it's unclear. But in any case, Malaysia for a long period of time featured this party state in the form of the UMNO, its own role in corporate shareholding, really since the 1970s, since Mahathir's new economic policy. The discipline on the firms came through the state, came through the party rather than through markets, right? So these huge government-linked companies, government-linked investment companies in Malaysia that often make terrible decisions but get bailed out and they get in trouble, their principals get in trouble, right? But it's not really a sense of market discipline, it's party-driven discipline. There's constant bailouts and interventions within the Malaysian markets. And as a consequence, there's limited innovation and there's persistent drain and capital flight from Malaysia over time. And if the CCP wants to have this discretion over the financial sector and it wants to have this political control and doesn't want to open itself to rule of law, it's very difficult for me to see, right, how they're able to develop a modern financial sector that can really generate the innovation-driven growth and the useful allocation and not wasteful allocation of resources that it would take to get from upper middle income country to highly developed, comprehensively wealthy, consumption-based and innovation growth, which we enjoy sometimes at our own detriment in the United States.
Perhaps I can just make one comment and 1.5 questions, perhaps. I mean, one is, I think it's really important and valuable to think back to the Central Financial Work Commission, because, I mean, it's kind of hard to remember now how excited people were at the time about this new institution and how they thought this is going to be the all-powerful regulator of the financial system in China and is going to do miracles to the system, like overcoming some of the trade-offs that you usually see in authoritarian system between discretion on the one hand. And so I think it's interesting also to remember from that moment, in addition to other things you mentioned, I think it's also, there were so many institutional vested interests that really sort of knew that this is going to be the big new regulator and didn't like the idea because they were losing sort of their own turf, and so many vested interests. And I think Hyman never published on that, but in his interviews also came across a lot of reservations. The opposition, I mean, just because there was this expectation that this is going to be the most powerful regulator ever. Yeah, and so perhaps my half question just goes to this. When you say discretion, like having worked as a bureaucrat for a little bit, I mean, no one likes to really have that discretion too much because you're also responsible for it. And it also means micromanaging, and it also means you are vulnerable to inspections and things like this. So it's a lot of risk. So I wonder, what discretion, can you elaborate on sort of the vision of discretion that, because she can't decide all the, all the loans by himself. So that would be my half question. And the full question, the longer question perhaps is, given the specific challenges that you pointed out, it seems like you have two big instruments that the Chinese government has in mind. One is sort of the ownership control, and the other is the party, of course. And so the golden chair on the one hand, the party committee on the other hand. And are these two alternative strategies, or do you think of them as sort of working in tandem together? Or is the government sort of figuring out which way to go? And which one do you personally think would be sort of more up to the challenge and perhaps, create a better Malaysian outcome than the other? Perhaps one is sort of still a better way than the other. and what the trade-offs are there. And I would have so many more questions and comments, but we also certainly have
Thank you.
questions.
Yeah, you know Heilmann's work well, I know. I just one word on this discussion. I'm not really a scholar of the bureaucracy, and so I'm not the person to say, here's who the biographies are of the people on the Central Financial Commission. I mean, that's just not what I do. But then when I talk about discretion, I really mean discretion on the part of the party state in general to intervene in financial markets, right? So financial markets work when you think that they will work, right? So they have to be able to allocate resources, meaning that firms that are fundamentally not doing efficient things have to have paths for market exit, and that has to be revealed through how their shares are priced or how capital is allocated to them, right? Whereas I don't think the CCP wants that. So the irony is that in 2015, if they had just let the market crash in 2015, they would have been much better off, right? And they would not have to deal with what they're dealing with now. But instead, they want that discretion because they fear, I think, the political instability and the contagion of it and the revelation it'll have for how state firms behave. And so they intervene, which just begets more intervention. And so a cycle of bailout. In a different paper, I call it rule by market. And so that's the discretion I'm interested in rather than that kind of bureaucratic discretion, which I can't claim to know that much about. And then your question about the two different means of supervision. So one is kind of party personnel in those places. So I would say I have only read one paper that I really liked on how the party works inside the financial organizations, and it's yours. I mean, just to say honestly, and for grad students in the room, I get asked to review papers all the time, and sometimes I do it, sometimes I don't, that are like, we're measuring party control in enterprises. And then they measure if the party is present or not. That actually doesn't tell us anything. It's not that interesting. People need to work a little harder. So figure out then, does that mean that the firms that have party personnel make more or better, worse or better decisions? Do they get more or less procurement contracts? Do they get more credit access or not, right? Just the fact of the party there. Because I think, and you've emphasized this, sometimes the party's there to monitor the party members, not just the organization itself, right? So I think there's a lot of work left to be done with that. But I do think we've underestimated this kind of the role of party as corporate shareholder that's really about information access and supervision and knowledge about what a firm is doing rather than just controlling it, right? So there's this kind of US perspective, which is like if the party state is there at 3%, then the party state's telling that firm what to do. Sometimes it's the opposite. If the party state's there at 3%, it's because they have no idea what that firm is doing and they want insight into what they're doing and they need to be closer, right, within the firm to do that. And so it's the opposite logic. It's a logic of I'm there because I'm afraid of you rather than I'm there because I'm controlling you. And so it's hard to tell the difference, right, from afar. But that, party on the board and the kind of shareholding, I think we have a lot of work to do on, and I think the Malaysia comparison is really interesting. And, the better outcome in Malaysia is when they go through bouts of privatization as well and kind of withdrawal of the party state in Malaysia when they want more economic growth, but then they find they don't like that either. And so this cycle, again, of bailout intervention, I would say that's what we're destined for in China, absent, huge personnel changes as a euphemism.
Yeah. Thanks. So I can now take questions.
I wanted to ask about capital flight and drain. Because you sort of listed several problems besetting the Chinese economy. Yeah. That was one of them. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about it relative to the others? Is it the biggest one? Because it seems like with enough technology and enough discipline, the party today actually, why can't they prevent that problem from happening and make it so that investors, they no longer have the opportunity to put their money overseas, so it's no longer a dilemma of overseas or domestic. Plan B, they still want to do something with it, so they will consume.
Should I take a few questions at once or just answer one by one?
So one hand right now. So if you can put it.
Okay. I'll just answer that one right now. But yeah, I'm not a specialist on things like the digital yuan or things like that, but I think that's part of it, right? And that all started, the impetus for that bureaucratically started, partly with U.S. economic statecraft, but it didn't start in 2020, right? That started way before that when they were concerned. So actually when China became included in the SDR in 2016, and the interesting thing is immediately the renminbi dropped, right? So when they liberalized it a little bit, and there's a lot of debate about whether that was an intentional devaluation or something that was surprising, right? But that capital flight really started in 2015, 2016. Well, it started a lot before that, but a lot of that flip of China as net recipient of global capital to China as net exporter, a lot of it wasn't intentional export of Chinese capital. And so some digital tools can be in control of that. But then you have the fundamental problem, which is who's in charge of the digital tools, right? So who's expatriated the most money is the people who have political privilege and sometimes party officials. So Xi Jinping, in the beginning of the corruption campaign, one of the first targets was what he called naked officials, right? People with their families abroad, their children abroad, and who held foreign assets. And so if it's the party state itself that's doing that, right? And that's why, rule of law means that the party state itself has to be subject to the same rules. And it's super hard to have that in a one-party state. I've never seen it. So I think that, technology can go so far, but then we're in kind of just a repression world, which I think has other consequences as well. And if you were a foreign investor and you knew you couldn't get it out, I refer to Mahathir's Malaysia in the late 1990s was called a roach motel because you can go in, but you can't go out, right? So I'm not sure, how many of the venture capital and private equity firms I know of would go into China knowing that they could never repatriate their dividends, and how many Chinese entrepreneurs would do that knowing that they could never get money out, even to go on a trip to Europe, right? Which many of them like to do, or they used to like to do.
So now we do have 3 questions
Okay.
there, and then Tom and Christina.
Okay.
My name is Catherine Fry. I'm a PhD student in political science at MIT. I'm not an econ person, so this might be a slightly naive question. I'm curious. Over the last half year or so, it seems like the Chinese government decided that the huge problem was just a lack of foreign investment, and they did all these things where they were trying to make the country more attractive for foreign investors again. And so I'm curious how you see that, because it seems like that is not really in any way addressing any of the structural issues. So was that essentially just amounting to trying to acquire more foreign investment and keep throwing it into the same machine that just kept this somewhat dysfunctional process going? Or so essentially were the responses of the last half year or entire year just completely missing the point and just going entirely past the problem?
Yeah. Thanks.
Tom Remington.
Thanks. Tom Remington, visiting professor in government. Meg, I thought that was a just magnificent job of putting everything together. Thank you very much. But I wanted to ask about what's sometimes called the shadow banking system, or off-bank, off-book financial activities, in particular as it pertains to local governments. The distinction between public and private sector in the economy seems to me a little bit arbitrary, and we sometimes perhaps overemphasize it. Doesn't seem to be such a bright line, given all of these off-book financial vehicles. So if we're going to wind down all of that indebtedness, which a lot of it is really shaky, where does the financial system enter into it? Can that problem be solved without a big crisis?
It's a great question.
Christina Davis.
Christina Davis, Professor of Government. Thanks. I learned so much in a short time. I wanted you to follow up on the comparison with Japan, where you alluded that the strong relationship with the United States offered some insurance during hard times for Japan. So if you could speak to China's fears and vulnerability, having so high a U.S. dollar reserves, or worries about sanctions, and how that constrains their financial choices.
Okay, thank you. So 3 great questions. So on FDI and foreign capital investment in general, number 1, I think there's a difference between what local governments want and what the central government wants, right? So there are these huge local government delegations that are going all over Europe, et cetera, saying we're desperate for our investment. A lot of that, I think, is employment driven. They want more jobs, right? And they want more investment in their jurisdictions. I don't think the central level authorities care at all, right, who's investing in China. They'll say they do, but if they want high-tech investment, things that are going to be useful to their upgrading plans, but sort of the era of jobs as such, on the national level, or we're just so happy to have foreign capital, that's not there. There's another part of it which is very interesting and very, very controversial right now, which is that in 2013, 2014, there was a huge invitation to foreign not direct investment, but portfolio investment, and including venture capital and private equity to invest in China's innovation sectors and frontier sectors. And the very interesting part of that was, I think the thinking at the time was, we have the technical talent that we need to develop semiconductors, quantum computing, AI, and we have the capital. We just don't know how to allocate it, right? So if the Chinese financial system allocates it, we're not going to allocate it right. So they invited everyone in, right? And this is definitely what the select committee who I got the privilege of talking to on Monday, that's what they think, right? So the Sequoias and the KKRs of the world went in and taught the CCP where the capital goes. I think they still want that expertise. And so they're very serious about that, but I don't think they're very serious about FDI, although, their calculations may change as the economic situation deteriorates and people get upset about it. And so I don't think anything is permanent in China. The second question from Tom on shadow banking, also a really good question. I guess I kind of visualize China's household savings as a big blob. They get squeezed into one place, they get squeezed into another place, right? And you can also imagine on the flip side, the demand for capital being like a gigantic sucking thing, and they're going to get capital where they can. So like they find creative ways like shadow banking for a while to do that, right? And I think a lot of the financial crackdown that was on the first couple of slides here is about cracking down on the shadow banking system, because shadow banking was really the vehicle that got politically connected firms into the system. I totally agree with you that the boundary between private and state is completely blurred. And Margaret Pearson and Kelly Tai and I have a paper in International Security about that, where we say that's the mechanism through which international backlash can partially be explained, such that you can't tell the difference between a Chinese firm and the Chinese state anymore, and that does not sit well with American institutions, in particular Western institutions. But the fundamental problem, which is how do you deal with household savings, how do you deal with companies that want and need to get credit, right? And that problem I don't see as solved just by whack-a-moling down the shadow banking system, right? Something else will pop up. Financial market participants are always very innovative, right? Financial innovation is very important in all kinds of countries. And so I see that as more of a symptom rather than the underlying cause. Christina's question about what does it mean about the external environment? So this is a huge question and what I'm spending a lot of time thinking about. And so as you know, there's some research in political science that wants to say that, peaking powers economically become more dangerous as such. And actually, it really depends on whether the external environment is favorable or unfavorable, right? So in Japan's case, I don't know much about Japan, right? But it's not as if Japan was somehow external to there were trade tensions, right, between Japan, but those were not military tensions, like as you've written yourself, right? So it's not as if those conflicts, those were fundamentally trade conflicts. We have trade conflicts with allies all the time, right? Whereas what's happening in China is it's a geopolitical and military rivalry between the US and China, as well as a conflict over economic issues. The trade issues, I think, are much less important than the technology issues and the interdependence and security issues, which are hard to disentangle, right? So what's happening in China then is, okay, well, now just in semiconductors in particular, if they say, okay, well, I guess we failed some of our goals of financial innovation and economic growth, no problem, we can buy chips from the West. No, they cannot, right? We can buy oil from, everyone. Not necessarily. You're going to have to buy it from Russia and Iran, right? And so you can see the ways in which that external environment doesn't enable them to say, okay, give us some time to work out our financial problems, give us some time to work out our economic growth problems. Instead, it becomes an impetus to double down on domestic innovation and indigenization because they don't trust that they can rely on the global trading system to get the resources they need, right? And so I don't know what that means in terms of how they'll manage it in China, right? And I don't know how it affected Japan in particular, just because I don't understand Japan at all, really, very much, right? But this system through which Japanese companies stayed competitive, actually, even as the economy stopped growing. Japanese companies continued to globalize, continued to stay competitive, partly through the flying geese and the acts of JICA and all these other kind of systems, which helped them move abroad and tariff jump and do all the things that they needed to do. And China, I think, is much more anxious that their companies won't be able to do that absent large-scale state intervention. And so the question then is, China, I think, is anxious and fearful rather than triumphant and taking victory laps, right, as it's usually described. It's not taking victory laps about things. It's very, very nervous. And so, if I were being asked by the U.S. State Department, what does it mean? I might say something like, now is a good time to reassure China that if there are, reforms, or if there are ways to do, let's say, reverse pathways to look at more accountability, more transparency into where chips are going, for example, then you can buy chips from the West. But if they're going into automated weapons or generative AI that we think is a threat, then you can't do that, right? Whereas instead, China feels closed in, I think, right now, and that may have more dangerous implications for the global order. But that's like the subject of a much different research agenda.
Yeah. Thank you very much,
Thank
Meg.
you.
This was a fascinating
Sorry
talk,
to keep you
and
late.
thank you all for coming.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks,
See you
Daniel.
next week.
Thank you.